In looking at this essay by Walter Schulz on the problem of death, the first thing that we should note about it, I think, is that it differs from most of the things that we read, in that it's an essay that somewhat is an essay in the history of ideas. It's not simply and only interested in making a central point or getting across a certain idea of death, but he believes that what we have to do to understand our contemporary approach to death, maybe not any one particular idea, but the general framework with which modern people of a typical sort approach the subject of death, what we need to do is to situate ourselves in the history of thinking about death. Human beings have engaged in, sweeping thing, but so there's a lot in here about a lot of different philosophers. Many different philosophers mentioned: Hegel, Kant, and thankfully Plato and the Phaedo, with which we are familiar. It's the central text here. Kierkegaard, other philosophers. It's not so much to try to remember each supposed thought or doctrine that's attributed to each philosopher, but to get a sense of the historical changes that saying we've gone through, the human species, at least in the West, in our thinking about death, and that there are previous ways of thinking about death. He doesn't think that they're recoverable. There's something admirable about them, perhaps, and insightful, but they're not ours. It seems to be what he's saying, that we are stuck in a certain framework with a certain idea of what's realistic and not realistic in terms of talking about death, and that this is the terms in which we talk about death are different than they used to be. The first line tells you what he's sort of up to here. He says, classical metaphysics from antiquity to Hegel. Hegel is a very important early 19th century German philosopher, died around, I believe, around 1830. So that's the time frame that he's talking about, from classical antiquity, the Greeks and Romans, to the early 19th century in Europe. Classical metaphysics from antiquity to Hegel is characterized by being committed to statements about death and dying essentially from the aspect of immortality. The loss of this metaphysics is one of the principal indications of the current attitude towards death. So the big word here, metaphysics. Classical metaphysics, there's no such thing. I mean, there are different sorts of metaphysical frameworks that may be seen as classical. But with regard to death, the point seems to be that the approach to the understanding of death was basically Plato's approach. It's the notion that there is something called a soul, something metaphysical, something that is real, and Plato would say the most real thing about us, the soul, psyche, mind, spirit, is referred to in different ways in this sense, but that there is something, we might as well call it the soul, which is an aspect of our being as human beings, but is not only different from and distinct from the body, but is something that's separate and independent from the body. We remember that in the Phaedo, the initial notion of death that Socrates starts with is that death is constituted by the separation of soul and body, and that metaphysical attitude is the notion that there is the body, which is part of the material world and subject to all the forces of nature and definitely mortal. That is, it comes to an end. But there is also the soul, which in a mysterious way is attached to the body, is not part of the natural world, has no physical, material being, but rather has ideal, spiritual, mental, however you want to differentiate it from the physical and material, that sort of being. That death is constituted by the separation of this soul from the body, and that the soul is something that which cannot die, which is immortal. This general framework for approaching death has this metaphysics, Schulz says, it was the dominant way for centuries to approach the matter in some way or another within this framework. And I think one of the big messages of this essay that comes out is this: that is gone. That is finished. Which is a very large claim because it may be that there are people in this class who would say, "What? I mean, there's no immortal soul. There's no afterlife." Well, I think that he, whatever he himself believed, as far as that, there are indications in this essay that that belief can certainly be a contemporary belief. That is a belief in an afterlife. But as he says later, it's an entirely private belief. After the philosopher Kant, as we'll maybe see a little bit, established that certain metaphysical questions were unanswerable. That is, that there was no argument that could establish the truth or falsity of certain metaphysical claims, one of which was the notion that there was an immortal soul that couldn't be verified. But after Kant, belief in the afterlife was no longer a kind of respectable philosophical belief. It was an entirely faith-based religious belief. And I think that Schulz would acknowledge that certainly there's a legitimate belief in the afterlife that people carry around with them. But it's entirely private and based on faith. It's not part of the public scientific, philosophical, rational discourse about reality, because there's simply no evidence for it. There's no way, using the tools of natural science, which become the dominant, you might say, epistemological tools for gaining knowledge, there's no way in the conditions of modern science that we can possibly talk sensibly about the soul. The issue here. So there is this definite sense in which he's trying to understand the break from the classical metaphysical view of death, from the viewpoint of the immortality of the soul, to the contemporary view of death. And really, I guess the whole essay is for that, in the sense that, again, this is his view, and written in the 1970s in Germany, of what our contemporary approach to death is, for the purposes of understanding it better by situating it historically and perhaps drawing from certain historical sources to bring out certain latent aspects of that. So what we need to do in this essay is first get a handle on what he thinks the contemporary view amongst educated human beings is of the reality of death. Contrast it with what he's calling the classical metaphysical view of death, which he thinks pretty much petered out in the 19th century. And then in the third part, see what he has to add. He certainly doesn't want to transform or negate or somehow completely revolutionize our modern view of death, but he wants to enrich it in the sense that he thinks that there are certain themes that we can draw from the past which we can use to be more enlightened about our own view of death. And that's the third part of the essay.